All right, thanks for coming along tonight, everybody. So if you haven't already done so, can you just put your microphones on mute? And if you've got any questions throughout the presentation, just pop them into the chat box and we'll cover off those at the end, just to give us time to get through the all the slides and everything uninterrupted. And then when we get to the end, I'll go back and answer all the questions. I'm happy to hang around for however long it takes to answer all the questions. So we'll get underway. Technology, excellent. Let's do this. Yeah. So disclaimer, of course, we live in a litigious society these days. So just, I'm not a solicitor, I'm not an accountant or a financial planner. I don't have an Australian Financial Services license. And the information that I'm giving tonight is of general nature and it's for educational purposes. Everyone's scenario is different. So please make sure that you speak to the relevant professionals to get the right advice for you and your situation. Okay, so who is this Glen Newbury bloke anyway? So I'm the owner of Utopian Property and an affiliate director of Suburbanite. So some of you will know me as Utopian Property and some of you will know me as Suburbanite and some of you won't know who the hell I am anyway, but hopefully you will by the end of tonight. So I'm a property investment advisor and a buyer's agent, and I've been investing in property for 23 years and I've done all sorts of investing from buy and holds to renovations and property developments, bought and sold properties overseas and also rooming houses. So I've done a fair bit and I'm on a continuous journey of learning through property investing. You can never know everything and I still get mentored in property investing today. And I spent a lot of time and money educating myself in all facets of property investing. So, and as I just mentioned, I've used various different strategies throughout that time frame. And I've built a property portfolio that has helped me pay off my home and also give me income. So, and I'll be talking about that in another webinar later on, but tonight we're talking about how to pay off your home. And I'm also the host of the Sydney Property Meeting. Usually we'd run a property meeting in Parramatta once a month. Obviously we're not doing that at the moment, being in lockdown here in Sydney, but once things open up again, we'll probably kick those off and we have a guest speaker every month and do a little bit of networking for anyone that wants to learn about property investing. So tonight, obviously we're here to talk about how to pay off your home. So this is what we're going to cover tonight, is setting goals, putting your team together, a very crucial step to being successful. Also, we're going to talk about, should we be investing in new or established properties and houses or units? We'll be talking about using equity to invest. We're going to be talking about property cycles and property selection, very important parts of the criteria. And we'll go through some real life examples. And then this is all how you can pay off your home and be debt free. So imagine what it would be like if you'd paid off your home and you were debt free. How would that feel? Right? So this is what we're going to try and talk about tonight and see if we can give you some knowledge on how to go about doing that through property investing. So the first thing we're going to talk about is putting your team together. This is definitely a crucial step towards being successful and making sure that you've got the right people on your side who are helping you achieve that goal. So the first one we'll talk about is a mortgage broker. Now, mortgage brokers, most people will need a mortgage broker or at least need a mortgage to achieve this goal, to buy investment properties. And I highly recommend going to mortgage brokers rather than going directly to a bank, because mortgage brokers have access to 30 or 40 different lenders and hundreds of different products. And they're able to find the right product for you in your situation to help you achieve that goal. So highly recommend speaking to a mortgage broker rather than going directly to the bank. Accountant is the next one. So obviously accountants can help you with your tax and also structures, but they help you become tax effective when you're investing. we all have to pay tax. It's the way the world goes round, but we don't want to pay more tax than we have to. And having a good accountant on your side who can set up the right structures for you can help you minimize tax and be tax effective. Property investors and property advisors and buyer's agent. Does anyone know a good one they can recommend? I don't know. Anyway, they can help you find the right property, give you the right advice, and tell you where you should be investing and help you find the right property for you to help you achieve that goal. Solicitors and conveyancers, they'll come further down in the process. Obviously, once you buy a property, or even if you're selling a property, you're going to need to have a solicitor or a conveyancer help you through that legal process. Pest and building inspectors, obviously, we want to make sure any property that we're buying does have, is not about to fall down around our feet because it's been eaten alive by termites. So obviously a good pest and building inspector. Property manager. Property managers are worth their weight in gold. So they're the ones that are going to be looking after the property, making sure you get a good tenant if you've got a good property manager, and also making sure they're taking care of the property and collecting the rent for you and doing all that. So having a good property manager is definitely high on the list, and a financial planner as well. So once you start purchasing investment properties and you're taking on more debt, you need to make sure you've got the right insurances in place so that if something does happen and you can't meet the mortgages, then, and I'm talking, from a, illness or something like that, if you've got the right insurances in place, it'll help you to make sure, that you can cover the mortgages and do that, while you're not able to work or whatever the scenario is. So having a good financial planner is also critical. Okay. So let's talk about new and established properties. So I have a view, and I'll talk about this, and you'll probably get a bit of a feeling of which way I lean towards properties when we go through this. So new properties tend to have greater depreciation and tax benefits because they're new, and established properties will typically have less depreciation benefits. Now the government changed the rules a while back, so you can only depreciate what you buy and put in. So if you do a renovation, you can depreciate that, but you can't depreciate, an air conditioner that was already there. And when I talk about new properties, I'm talking about new house and land packages or off the plan type properties. I'm not talking about something that's only a couple of years old, because that comes under the established banner. So, these properties, the new properties, will give you better depreciation and better tax benefits, but that's not a reason why we buy them, right? We invest because we want to make money, not because we want to minimize tax. That's just a byproduct of what we do. Also, there's less perceived maintenance costs. Now, it is perceived. Obviously in Sydney, there's been quite a bit of media around housing estates that are having issues, and they're not very old. So, some of the building standards haven't been up to scratch, unfortunately, for those people. But, they say there's, less maintenance in a new property and potentially higher maintenance costs on established property. But when you think about your own home and how much, yes, we all spend money improving the home, because we want to make it better because we're living there. But how much money do we actually spend fixing things that are broken, actual maintenance? In reality, it's typically, quite low. So we would spend much more money on improvements than we would on actual maintenance. So generally speaking, new properties have a higher purchase price. So if we had two properties in the same market, a new one and an established one, and they were similar types of properties, then we would expect to pay significantly more for the brand new one than we would for the established property. And that might be, for example, $150,000 more for the new product than for an established one. But the price difference in the rent might only be, let's say, $100 a week, which is $5,000 a year. So potentially you're going to spend $150,000 more to get only $5,000 a year extra in rent, where you could potentially buy an older property in the same location for less money. And yes, you're going to get $5,000 a year less, but your mortgage is going to be much lower and your cash flow will be better. And that actually brings me to my next point, which is higher rent but lower cash flow. Because your mortgage is higher in a new property and the rental difference is not that great, then typically, yes, you get a higher rent, but your cash flow is lower. And on the other side, on an established property, you might be getting a lower rent, but you've got better cash flow because your mortgage repayment is lower because you're purchasing at a lower price. So, and I'm going to be talking about cash flow in a little bit more detail later on. More supply and slower growth for a new property. So when we talk about new properties, I'm talking in this scenario about, potentially units or, house and land packages, because when you go and buy, say, for example, a house and land package, what else is around that house and land package? 100 other house and land packages. So generally speaking, you're not going to get growth in that house and land package until the other 99 have been sold and there's still demand in that market. You only get growth when demand outstrips supply. That's what causes growth. And where you've got a scenario, and even with, the new units, most capital cities have oversupply of units. And I mean, you've only got to look around here in Sydney, how many unit blocks are going up. They're quite quick to build, so they can add supply quite rapidly. And what happens is there becomes an oversupply and the growth is much slower. And sometimes it's negative. Like when you buy, they're actually worth less when you actually settle than when you purchase them. Obviously, in an established area, which has already been built out, the land supply is, all absorbed. And, the only thing they can do is buy what's already there. And if people want to live there, typically house and land packages are further out, from the city, and, more established areas are closer to the city. So those areas will generally grow faster because there's more demand and there's less supply, right? So generally speaking, they tend to grow faster. And we have very limited ability to add value to a brand new property. Everything is new. It's not like you can go and put new carpets in or give it a fresh coat of paint, or that you can change colors, but is that going to add value? Probably not. And, your window furnishings are all new kitchen, everything's new. The only way you could probably add value to a new property is through landscaping or something like that. Whereas you can go and buy an established property, might be a little bit tired, and you can put in some new carpet, give it a fresh coat of paint, some new window furnishings, and, maybe even a new kitchen or a new bathroom. And that's definitely going to add value. You can also add value to it through subdivision. If you buy something that's on a larger block, you can subdivide that block and you can sell off the back block, or you can develop it and build something on it. That's going to add value to it. Whereas, and this is my next point, is that, one, they're already further away. We've spoken about that, and the established ones are close to the city. But generally, the newer estates have much smaller blocks of land, and the more established areas have larger blocks of land, which have that ability to subdivide and create a bit more density than the new estates. New estates, generally speaking, have reasonable sort of density anyway, and they're on a smaller block. So that's new versus established. And, it takes several years for a new property to see the resale value. People don't buy a new property and then sell it in 1 or 2 years' time. So you can't actually see what the resale value of that is going to be for probably, 3, 4, 5 years down the track, when someone decides to move somewhere else and then puts that property on the market. Whereas established areas and established properties are being sold in those markets, quite regularly. So it's easy to see, comparative sales and things like that, and understand what the resale value of that product is going to be. So it's not so easy in a new estate. In my opinion, much better off buying an established property over a new property. And that's something that I've always done in my own investing, is always purchased established properties for investment. Okay, houses versus units. So at the moment, as I just said before, in most capital city, there's oversupply of units, and it's very easy for them to add stock. And the problem that we have at the moment is not just an oversupply of properties for sale, but oversupply of rental properties in some locations. Because in normal times, when we have our normal numbers of international migration, and also we have international students here and things like that, those that demographic are the ones that would typically rent units and things like that. Well, they're not here at the moment. And we don't have the international migration. The international students have gone. So we have a lot of vacant units in certain areas in the capital cities. Houses, on the other hand, have become in much greater demand, especially during lockdown, because people want that space and the freedom to be able to move around and don't have cabin fever inside of a unit. So, and houses obviously also come with a larger land component, and land is what goes up in value. They're not making any more land, right? So that is what actually increases in value. It's not the dwelling, it's the actual land. But it, and that ties into the location of the land, obviously, as well. Okay, so we're going to now talk about using equity. Now, I understand that there are people on here that are already existing investors, but there are also people here that haven't invested yet and don't understand what equity is. So if you already understand equity, then just bear with us for the next few minutes as we just sort of run through this and explain what equity is and how that you use it to invest in property. So what is equity? It's the difference between the value of your home and the amount of debt or the existing loan that you have on your home. How much is that? So in a scenario, let's say you have a home that's worth $1 million at the moment, and in Sydney, that's probably just about everything. And let's say that you have $600,000 debt on that property. So the bank owns 60% of that property. So the remaining portion of that is $400,000. That is your equity. That's the part of the property or the amount of the property that you own. So you own 40% of that property. However, you can't access 100% of the equity, right? So this is where we talk about accessible equity. What is actually accessible? So again, we'll go back to the scenario, and let's say you've got a home that's worth $1 million. Generally speaking, you can access up to 80% of the value of the home, which means 20% of that equity is not available. You can't access that. This is not 100% true. You can, access more than 80%, but generally speaking, I wouldn't recommend people access more than 80% of their own home. On an investment property, different story, but of your own home, I wouldn't recommend more than 80%. So that means 20% is not accessible. So if you have a remaining debt of $600,000, so the bank owns that 60%, that only leaves you with 20% of accessible equity. So in this scenario, that would be $200,000. So what can you do with that? So again, if we talk about having 20% equity and $200,000 as accessible, what can we do? Okay, so let's say we're going to buy a property for $500,000 and we're going to use a 20% deposit. So 20% of $500,000 is $100,000. And then you'll also have around about 5% purchase costs. So your purchase costs are things like stamp duty, your legal fees, and pest and building costs. And that, generally speaking, is about 5%. So in this scenario, that's an extra $25,000. So we'll need $125,000 out of that $200,000 accessible equity to purchase this investment property for $500,000. And then we'll get a loan for 80%, which is the remaining $400,000 of the purchase price. Now, you can actually do this with less than a 20% deposit. You can actually purchase an investment property with a 10% deposit. Now, you'll have to pay lender's mortgage insurance, which is around about $2,000 for every $100,000. So in this scenario, it'd be an extra $10,000. But in that scenario, you would have, instead of paying a $100,000 deposit, you'd only be paying $50,000 plus your $10,000 lender's mortgage insurance and your $25,000 purchase cost, your 5% purchase cost, would be $85,000. With this $200,000, you could buy 2 investment properties for $500,000 if you had the serviceability to be able to do that. But then you would have 2 properties that are growing in value, not 1. Okay, so that's how you can really leverage. And we always want to use equity where we can. We don't want to use cash. We want to keep cash. So the rule with investing, for me anyway, this is Glenn's rule, always use equity in investment properties first. Obviously, if you don't have an investment property, you can't do that. So if you don't have that, then you use equity in your home. Right? Use equity in your home to get started, but once you've got equity in investment, you don't use equity in the home anymore. Right? If you don't have your own home, then unfortunately you have no choice but to use cash. Right? So, but we don't want to use cash if we can avoid it. Once you have a home and you've got equity, use that, keep your cash. Cash is king, never want to be using cash. And there's no tax advantages to using cash, not giving accounting advice, but there's no tax advantages to using cash, but there are tax advantages to using equity. So we always want to use equity where we can. Use the bank's money. Okay, now we're going to be talking about property selection and area selection. So what we want to do is we want to locate emerging suburbs with good fundamentals. So when I'm talking about fundamentals, I'm talking about things like infrastructure, transport, shopping centres, schools, parks, hospitals, universities, and access to employment. So, you know, with the transport and good jobs available in those locations. And also locate areas that are likely to obtain quick capital growth. So again, we're talking about population growth. When the population grows in an area, it creates demand for housing and pushes prices up. And we also want to make sure that we look at vacancy rates. So you want to buy in an area where the vacancy rates are low, because that means there's strong rental demand. So anything typically under 2% is a good rental market. If it starts going up over 2%, it means that there's a lot of supply of rental properties available. And that can mean that your properties will be vacant longer and rents will potentially go down. Whereas if it's below 2%, it means it's a strong rental market. There's not a lot of rental properties available and rents will typically go up because demand is greater than supply. Okay, also properties that have good cash flow. And as I said before, we're going to talk about cash flow pretty soon. So, but you want to be buying properties that have good cash flow. You never buy a property based on yield. Yield is good, and it's the general term that people use. Oh, I've got a 7% yield, but you could have a 7% yield property that is massive negative cash flow because of the expenses. Yield is only an indicator of income. It's not an indicator of expenses. Cash flow is income minus expenses, and I'll talk about that in a moment. We also want to focus on properties that are affordable. So in my time in investing, I've always purchased properties that are affordable to the masses in that market. Obviously, the more people that can afford to buy that property, then the more potential demand there is, and the faster those properties will grow. As a property grows in value, less and less people can afford to buy it. And what that means is the demand will actually slow down, or the demand will fall, and the growth will slow down. $1 million, $2 million, $3 million properties still grow in value, obviously. But as less and less people can afford to buy it, the demand does fall away, and the growth will slow down a little bit. So they don't grow as fast on a percentage basis, generally speaking, as more affordable properties do, because more people can afford to buy them. There's more demand, and that pushes price up faster. So what we want to make sure we do also is when we purchase a property, we want to negotiate well and try and make money on the way in. And this comes through building relationships. And that's obviously, you know, as buyer's agents, what we do, we build relationships with the real estate agents that will allow us to, you know, purchase properties, you know, get a heads up on properties that are coming up in the market before they go to open market, but also to be able to negotiate. And we want to make sure when we're looking for properties that we tick all the boxes. Okay, now we're going to be talking about the property cycle or the property growth cycle. So property goes through cycles, and it varies from location to location, but generally speaking, a property cycle from the peak of the market till the next time it peaks is around about 10 years. Like I said, that varies. And I'm talking about capital cities here. In regional areas, that growth cycle is longer. It's a longer period between peaks. And so what we look at is, between that sort of 7 to 10 years, properties will, grow substantially and sometimes double in value during that period. Now, out of that 10-year cycle, the growth phase is typically around about 3 years. So we want to make sure that we're, getting into the market and buying properties when an area is coming into its growth phase, because what that does is it allows us to minimize risk. If we buy in a market that's getting growth almost straight away, then what that's doing is minimizing our risk that if the market comes down, that we're not going to lose money. And when properties grow in value, they start here and they grow, they hit the peak, and then they stop growing, and then they start coming down a little bit, but they never go back to where they started from, right? So they'll grow in value, come up to here, might come down a little bit of a correction in the correction phase, and then they'll go flat, but then they'll start taking off again later on. So they never go back to where they started from. So we want to try and be buying properties as they're coming into the growth phase. Now, how do you know it's coming into its growth phase? The only way you know is because properties are going up in value, and you only know that the actual growth phase has stopped. And if you look at what's on screen here, you can see the peak there is growing at around about 40% per annum. Now, when it hits the peak and starts coming down, that doesn't mean the properties are losing value. It just means that the growth rate is slowing down. It slows down to 30% per annum, 20% per annum, 10% per annum, and then it goes to zero, where it's not doing anything at all. It's not growing, but it's not losing money. And then it goes into negative growth behind, like below the white line. That's where property values are actually coming down, right? So we want to avoid buying in a market that's getting close to, the cycle is slowing down, and we've got potential to lose money. So we want to be buying in a market when it's coming into its growth cycle and ride that wave of growth. That's the best thing, right? So that's what we want to be doing. So, and that helps to minimize our risk of losses if the market changes and the market shifts. Okay, so we're going to talk about cash flow now. So cash flow is where I believe most people go wrong in investing, because they focus a lot on the capital growth, because they want to, buy a property for $500,000 that's going to grow, to $600,000, $700,000, $800,000. But what they forget about is the cash flow, and that means how much that property is going to cost you. So what cash flow actually is, for those that don't know, it's the rental income minus the operational expenses. So think of things like your mortgage costs, obviously, and council rates. We're going to go through an example in a moment just to show you what I mean by that. And then the ideal scenario is to have cash left over after all of that. So when all of the rent comes in for the year, and then you've paid all of the expenses for the year, to have some money left over in your pocket, that's the ideal scenario. And that's what we call positive cash flow, right? It's different to positively geared. They're two different things. Positive cash flow is pre-tax. We're talking pre-tax here, right? So where your income minus expenses leaves you in a positive position. But in reality, most properties, and especially when you're borrowing 100% plus for the value of the property because you're using equity, in reality, a lot of properties can be negative cash flow, where all of the rent doesn't quite cover all of the expenses for the property. But what you want to do here, the key is to be as close as possible to zero, right, where it's not costing you anything. So I'm going to run through an example here, and we'll use the example of the $500,000 property, which we used before. So in this scenario, to work out the mortgage costs, what I've done is worked out $500,000 purchase plus your 5% purchase cost. So I'm working the mortgage out on a value of $525,000. And you need to consider that equity that you're using, because there's a cost associated to the equity. You're still paying interest on that equity loan as well, right? So you're paying interest on 105% of the purchase price. So we need to factor that into our cash flow. All right, so let's assume that we can buy a property for $500,000 that is going to rent out for $420 a week. Now that is very achievable in some markets in Australia. So that's going to give us an annual rent of $21,840, assuming the property is rented out for the full 52 weeks of the year. Now that's a 4.37% yield. Now, if we talk about yield, and I said before, you don't buy a property based on yield, you always buy it based on cash flow. But yield is an indicator that there might be good cash flow. But in Sydney at the moment, just to give you a bit of a guide, in Sydney at the moment, the average rental yield is around about 2.6%, right? So those properties are, generally speaking, going to be negative cash flow, because if your interest rate's 3% and you're only getting 2.6% in as income, you're already 0.4% behind just on your interest cost, not even talking about all of the other costs associated, which we're about to talk about now. So when we talk about the expenses, operational expenses, we're talking about things like council rates. So in this scenario, this is a live example where we purchased this property for a client, and the council rates were around about $1,600 per year, which is $30.77 per week when you divide that by 52. Water rates are around about $1,000 a year. Now, there's no strata fees on this property because it was a house, so we don't need to take that into consideration. But if you are buying a unit, that's a figure that you'll have to include in there as well, how much your strata costs are per annum. And then your building insurance, around about $1,200. Your landlord's insurance, definitely have to have that. That's around about $400 a year. And then put in there a maintenance budget of, say, $500 a year. So all up, and then property management, of course. So property management in Adelaide is quite expensive compared to what we would be used to here in Sydney. Sydney, we pay somewhere around about 5.5% or thereabouts. In Adelaide, it's 7.7 to 8.8. And one of the reasons behind that is that in Sydney, the rents are actually higher, so the agents can charge a lower percentage, whereas in Adelaide, rents are a little bit lower, so they charge a higher percentage to, I guess, make it worth their while from a dollar perspective. So this one's going to cost $1,921 per year for property management. They're worth their weight in gold. Don't skimp on a property manager. And then your loan repayments. And here I've used a scenario of 3% interest rate. Generally speaking, when you're buying an investment property, you would get an interest-only loan as opposed to a principal and interest. Certainly for the first, sort of 3 to 5 years, interest only. And in this scenario, $15,000 worth of interest payments for the year on that $525,000 worth of loans. So all up, this property is going to cost $430 per week in expenses, but we're only getting $420 a week from rental income. So what that means is this property is costing $10.45 per week every week to hold. Now, if you can't afford $10 per week, you probably shouldn't be buying an investment property in the first place. But that's the idea. You want to try and keep that number as close to zero as possible. If the rent was higher, we might be making $10 a week positive, right? Which means you'd have to pay tax on that. Well, after all the tax depreciation or whatever. But yeah, the idea is, if it can't be positive cash flow, then we want it to be as close to neutral or zero as possible, because we can hold a lot more properties that are costing $10 a week than we can hold properties that are costing us $200 a week, right? So that's what cash flow is. It's a very important part. And this is where I think people go wrong is they don't look at the cash flow. They don't understand what a property is going to cost them on a week-to-week basis. And keep in mind, interest rates are at an all-time low. They are not getting any lower than they are today. There's only one way they're going to go, and that's up. And over time, over a 10-year period, on average, the interest rate in Australia is about 7%. Now, we're probably not going to get back to there anytime soon, but I definitely think we'll see some interest rises probably sometime next year. Banks are already talking about putting in certain things to try and cool the market down a little bit. So you need to do some stress testing here with this spreadsheet and pop in 5%, for example, as the interest rate to see what that weekly cash flow figure changes to, because that might go to $50 a week, right? Now, you need to be able to cover that. Don't just look at what it is today. You need to know what it's going to be when those interest rates start increasing. So make sure you look at your cash flow if you're buying an investment property and do some stress testing on it. Okay, so now I'm going to show you, this is a property that I purchased. It was one of mine, it's not anymore, but this is a property that I purchased, and I want to show you how you can use investing to pay off your home and become debt-free. So this property you can see here, there's my name, I was the one that bought it. And I bought it on the 13th of March, 2013. It's in a suburb called Ambervale, which is, for those of you who don't know, is a suburb out Campbelltown in Sydney. And I purchased this property for $270,000. So very affordable at that time in the market. It's a 3-bedroom house, 1 bathroom, and kind of a 1.5 car garage. So for this property, I looked at the fundamentals. So it was a suburb with good fundamentals. It was very close to all of those things that we're talking about. It was close to the shopping centre. Campbelltown Hospital at the time was going through a bit of an upgrade. The University of Western Sydney was not too far away from there. They've also got a large TAFE out there, close to the MacArthur Square Shopping Centre and MacArthur Railway Station. So all of the fundamental schools, parks and everything were there. So, and it was a growing area. So, a little bit further out in that location, they were doing house and land packages. So people are moving out that way, creating the demand and pushing the prices up. So I targeted it as an area that was quite likely to get quick capital growth. It had good cash flow. So I rented this property out for $395 a week, which was a 7.6% yield on the purchase price. Now, you can't get that in Sydney anymore. And if you can, let me know, because I'll buy the property. Those days are gone for the moment. They may come back at some point in time, but at the moment, you definitely won't get that in the Sydney market. But the cash flow on this property was good. Even though I'm talking about yield, it was, the cash flow was actually quite good. And the property was definitely very affordable in that market. It was affordable to the masses that could afford to buy that, and negotiated well and made money on the way in. And how I knew that, and this is where we come back to resale value and things like that when you're comparing new properties and established properties, is there was a house in the same street, still a 3-bedroom house. They're all, built around about the same time. It was one of those house and land estates, back in the day when it was built. And there was one in the same street that had sold not long before for $311,000. Now, it was in a little bit better condition than this one, but not $40,000 worth of difference, price difference. So I knew I was getting a good deal when I purchased it for $270,000. Now, you can see a new contract here with my name and the same address. I then sold this property in August 2017, and I sold it for $565,000. So once I'd paid, or took out all of that's $295,000 gross profit. By the time you take out your purchasing costs, your selling costs, and also capital gains tax, which I had to pay on this property, it left me with about $240,000 net profit. This is the property that actually paid off the remainder of my home. how long would it take you to pay off $240,000 off your home loan if you were just doing it through normal repayments, or even if you were chucking in an extra $100 or $200 a week? How long would that take you? That's like 5 or 10 grand a year extra you're taking off the loan, right? So if you're buying in the right locations and at the right time in the market, now some people out there might be going, oh yeah, but that was when Sydney boomed and everything. But you know, it was about the fundamentals. Did I know Sydney was going to boom at the time? No, but I did know the fundamentals were right. And did other properties, so this property more than doubled in value in that time frame. Did other properties double in value in that time frame? Yes, some did, but not everything did. To me, it was because it was affordable and the demand was there. So, but to prove that we can do this in today's market, then I'm going to show you a recent purchase. This is a property we got for a client very recently in South Australia. So also showing you, can you still buy properties for $500,000? Yes, you can. So this particular property, you'll see here, we purchased on the 10th of June this year for $420,000 for this client. And today it's valued at $465,000 or estimated value. That's 10.7% growth in 4 months, right? So there's no reason, and South Australia or Adelaide, this is about 20 minutes out of Adelaide. And Adelaide is in its growth cycle. So it's, you know, a little bit further along than that red dot that we looked at before in its growth cycle, hasn't hit its peak yet. And there's no reason why this property won't grow $100,000 or more. Can we guarantee that? No, we can't. But there's no reason why that's not possible given the growth that's already had in this short time frame. So as I said, that's 10.7% growth in less than 4 months. So, you know, obviously we haven't hit the 10th of October yet, which will be 4 months. So, you know, again, this property, this client is looking to pay off their home. So we needed to find a property that was in a good growth location that was going to give them that growth. All the indicators are there. As I said, you can never guarantee growth, but if you look at all of the indicators, then there's no reason to believe that the area won't grow and you won't get really good capital growth out of this property and ride the wave of growth. And this property rented out day one. So they have one open home and it rented out for $450 per week. And I think from memory, that gives this client about $30 or $40 a week positive. After 105% borrowing, it gives them about $30 or $40 per week in their pocket every single week. So there's no reason why you can't do this too. So yeah, so I hope that's given you, I guess, a bit of an idea of what you can do and how it can be done. It can be done. Don't think, yeah, you know, you did that in the boom. You know, it can still be done today. You've just got to pick the right locations. So everyone can do this. You don't need to be a millionaire to be able to do it. Equity is good if you can get it, but if you don't have that and you've got some cash to get started, you can buy the cheaper properties in, you know, good areas in capital cities that are going to grow in value. So I'm doing another webinar on the 14th of October, and the topic on this one is going to be how to retire on $2,000 per week through property investing. So as I mentioned earlier, my portfolio not only helped me pay off the debt on my home, but it also gives me income to retire on. So I'm going to show you how I did that in the next webinar. So thanks very much for attending tonight. We've got plenty of time for questions, and I think I can see plenty here in the chat box. There's my contact details. If you want to scan the QR code, if you know me from Utopian Property, scan the blue one. If you know me from Suburbanite, scan the green one. There's my email address. Scan both of them if you like, I don't care. Yeah, thanks very much for coming, and we'll answer some questions. So let me go back and let's see what we've got here. Okay. Yep. Property management fees, yes, they are. So Jenny's asking, are property management fees set or negotiable? They are negotiable, but just, property managers are worth their fees. Don't skimp, don't go for the cheapest one, because when it comes to property management, quite often you'll get what you pay for. And, if you don't have a great property manager, then you're probably going to get a bad tenant. Having a good property manager is no guarantee that you're not going to get a bad tenant, but at least they're doing, all the checks and everything that they can to make sure that you're getting a good tenant into your property. So I wouldn't skimp on a property manager. They are worth their weight in gold, and they deal with all the hard stuff. You don't have to worry about it. You don't have to stress. Yep, they'll contact you with some issues every now and then, but at the end of the day, they're the ones, you're paying them to deal with it. So, they'll just ask you your opinion and what, you want them to do. But they're definitely worth their weight in gold. So yes, you can negotiate it down, but I think, just search around, see what the other prices are, and then gauge it from that. But so you definitely can still negotiate it. Engage the best property manager. That's right. The difference does end up minimal. When you're talking about 1% on, $420 a week, it's like $4 a week more, which is like $200 a year. So it's definitely worth it, in my opinion. Is positive cash flow on a first property achievable? Yes, it is. Even though I didn't actually show that one there, that was $10 a week. You can, I wish I'd done the cash flow on that other property. That one was, from memory, it was about $30 or $40 a week, positive cash flow after 105% borrowings and our fee, which is included in the borrowing. So it was actually more than 105%. That was all included in it. And it worked out at, like I said, at about, about $30 or $40 a week positive cash flow. Keep in mind that things are positive cash flow at the moment because interest rates are so low, right? When they get back up to 4 and 5%, the possibility of positive cash flow, especially when you're borrowing 100%, really does become a challenge and more unlikely. Any property can be positive cash flow. It depends on how much money you're borrowing to buy that property. So, if you buy $1 million property, generally speaking, that's going to be negative cash flow, especially if you borrow 80 or 90% to buy that property. But if you chip in 50% cash and you're only borrowing 50%, then it's probably going to be positive cash flow, even if it is a 4 or 5% interest rate, right? So anything can be positive cash flow. It depends on how much you're borrowing. But when we're talking about utilizing equity and effectively borrowing, more than 100%, at the moment, yes, you can get positive cash flow, but as interest rates increase, that will become less and less likely. And that's, as I said, where you need to really be stress testing your cash flow to make sure that when those interest rates go up, you can still afford whatever that's going to be costing you in reality. Positive cash is achievable, Luke says. G'day, Luke. Good to see you online. Also, what's the reasoning for an interest-only loan? So it does keep your cash flow higher, obviously. And what we want to do, because, and it depends on your goals and what you're trying to achieve. In this scenario, what we're talking about is buying a property, getting capital growth in the property, and then potentially selling it down, taking that profit and paying it off on our home so that we become debt-free, right? We don't have any personal debt. So our home's paid off, our credit cards, our cars, everything's all paid off. So in this scenario, we're not planning to own the property at any point in time, just in this scenario. Obviously, if you're looking to keep the property long-term and you want to keep it for income down the track, then yes, you do want to pay down the debt at some point in time. And this is where I'll be getting into it a bit more next webinar, where there's a few different phases, accumulation phase and consolidation phase. Generally speaking, during an accumulation phase where you're building a portfolio and you want to buy a number of properties, you want to try and keep your cash flow as high as possible. And the way to do that is do interest-only loans. Later on down the track, you will convert from interest-only to principal and interest repayments to pay them down. But during that initial phase, generally speaking, you want to go interest-only loans, and and that's the way you do it. So I hope that answers the question. So that was from Jenna. So I hope that answered your question, Jenna. If it didn't, just pop another question in there. Oh, yep. So yep, someone else has answered there. Mish Lee's answered that. Is the spreadsheet I referred to in the earliest slides available somewhere? And are the slides going to be available? So this meeting is being recorded, so you'll be able to watch it. I think I have most of your email addresses from when you registered. I can send you out an email to the link to be able to watch the video. Am I going to make the slides available? Unfortunately not. I won't be making them available, but by all means, you can watch the video again. The spreadsheet, the cash flow sheet that I showed you, that's one that I've used for my own investing, like when I'm assessing a property. That's the exact cash flow. Again, if you want a copy of that, I'm more than happy to send that out. Shoot me an email, one of those two email addresses you see on the screen at the moment, and I'm more than, just say, hey, can you send me the cash flow sheet? More than happy to send that through. But there's no warranty on the sheet. If you change things on it, well, concrete warranty. Once it's off, the concrete's gone. Okay, Tim, what's the strategy once the interest-only period ends? Is it refinance and keep rolling over? In this scenario, yes, you'd probably roll it over to P&I. Getting another interest-only loan, you either have to go through a full refi and a reapplication. Once upon a time, you could just ring the bank up and say, hey, I want to roll it into another 5 years, and they just roll it into another 5 years. Those days are gone. You now got to go through a full application. And it's really just depends on where you are in your journey and what your goals are as to whether you would roll it into another interest-only, refinance it, roll it into another interest-only, or whether you would just flick over to P&I. And again, that comes down to a cash flow thing and where you are at that point in time, whether you can afford the extra repayments, what the interest rates are. So it's a really, you've got to look at it at that point in time and to assess it. But you want to, if your interest-only period's coming up, you want to be looking at it sort of 6 months out to work out what you're going to do, because if you are going to put in an application to refinance it away or something, you want to get that rolling before it actually flips over. So make sure you start looking at that, probably 6 months out before the interest-only period ends. Okay. Do banks like more equity or better income for serviceability? So that, really it's based on income. They don't, equity, you can't live on equity. They want to see your ability to repay the loan, right? So can you use equity to repay a loan? Yes, you can, but generally speaking, they won't take that into consideration. What they're looking at is your cash flow and your ability to meet the repayments. If the property is vacant for a period of time, are you able to actually meet the repayments? But have a chat to your broker, and they'll definitely be able to guide you from that. I'm obviously not a broker, but they want to look at your ability to repay that loan and cover the mortgage repayments. So it's more about your cash flow rather than your equity on that. So what else? Do I recommend selling or using equity for the next? So usually I would use equity, and that's certainly what I've done within my portfolio. I've always utilized equity from used equity from my home. And again, this is something I'll potentially be covering in the next webinar. I've used equity from my home to get started. And then once you get equity in an investment property, you don't touch the equity in your home anymore. You use the equity from the investment to buy your next investment, right? And then you just keep going like that. And that's how you sort of build it up. Do you sell? You only sell if you've got a purpose for that money. So in my scenario, I saw the opportunity there to be able to pay off my home loan and be debt free. So for that, I went, yep, okay, I'm going to sell it, because every time you sell a property, you're going to get hit with capital gains tax. You can pull the equity out. Now, you can't access 100% of the equity, but you're not going to get 100% of the profit anyway, because you're going to have to pay capital gains tax and selling costs and all that sort of thing. So you might as well keep hold of the property and just use the equity from that to go and buy the next one, rather than selling it down and paying capital gains tax. At some point in time, if you do decide to sell it down, then you're going to have to pay capital gains tax. It's just the way the world goes around, unfortunately. But again, that's where your accountant comes into play. Make sure you've got, so when you're buying a property, you want to make sure you need to have an idea of what the plan for that property is going forward. Is it a property that you're going to buy and hold long-term forever for income, when you retire? Or is it something you're potentially going to sell down and take profit from? Because who owns that property will change depending on that scenario. Now, obviously, did I know I was going to sell that property down? No, I didn't at that point in time when I bought it. I was actually keeping it for a long-term hold initially. But then once the market had grown and I had all that growth, I just saw that opportunity to be personally debt-free. And that's really what you want to do. It's okay to have investment debt, but I don't want to have personal debt. And I want my home to be debt-free. That way, if anything, goes wrong, you can sell down the property portfolio and you've still got your home and it's debt-free, right? So that's the way I looked at it. So you've always got to have it when you're selling a property. You've always got to have a purpose for it. What are you going to do with that money? But if you don't have to sell it and you can utilize equity, the reason I didn't utilize equity to pay off my home is because, not giving accounting advice, but once you use equity from an investment for a personal use, which would have been to pay down my personal debt on my home, is no longer, well, that portion is not tax deductible. So that's why I sold it rather than used equity from it to pay down the home, because that $240,000 that I used to pay down my home, that portion of the loan on the investment property would no longer have been tax deductible. The interest I accumulate on that $240,000 wouldn't have been tax deductible because I've used investment money to pay down a personal debt, right? So when you're doing something like that, you're using investment money to do something personal with, buy a car, go on a holiday, you kind of need to sell. You don't have to sell, but you just need to understand that that's not going to be tax deductible. Cool. So in my scenario, $10 holding week, what do the tax incentives look like on an established home? So there would still be tax incentives there, because there is still some depreciation and things like that. And of course, that $500 per year would come off the taxable income of the owner, whoever's owning that property at the time. But keep in mind, the tax incentives are not the reason that we do it, because at the end of the day, if you're on a 30% tax bracket, and for those that don't know, people talk about saving tax. So if you've got a property that's costing you $200 a week to hold, which is $10,000 a year, and you're earning $100,000, and then you're paying 30% tax out of that, so you're left with $70,000 in your pocket, but then $10,000 of that is going to pay, the holding costs on an investment property. Now you've only got $60,000. When you go to the tax man at the end of the year, they say, well, you paid tax on $100,000, but in actual fact, you didn't earn $100,000. You only earned $90,000 because you lost $10,000 here. So you've actually paid tax on 100, but you should have only paid tax on 90 because you lost 10,000. So what we're going to do is we're going to give you $3,000 back, because that's the 30% of the $10,000 you lost. End result is you're still down $7,000, right? Yes, we do want to be as tax effective as possible, but we don't invest just for the tax reasons, right? So yeah, tax on that, would be pretty minimal, or the tax incentives on that, but that's fine. Right. So, and if you can afford it, like, I mean, if you've got bucket loads of surplus cash flow, like, you know, doctors or solicitors or whatever, who just have a lot of surplus cash flow, then, you know, they can go and buy properties that are costing, you know, $100 or $200 a week to hold, because they have the surplus cash flow to do that, and that offsets their tax, and that's all fine. But, you know, most people aren't, you know, in that position. You know, they don't have hundreds of dollars a week surplus cash flow out of their you know, weekly incomes. So that's why you really need to focus on doing this. But yep, certainly if you're earning bucket loads of money and you can afford to do that, I still don't think that would be the right thing to do. Why would I do that? You know, when I can do it this way. But yeah, if you can afford to do it, then that's fine. Okay. Yep, thanks, Jenny. Very important to have a property investment advisor. Still looking for a good one. Yep, I think that's it. I don't think I can see any more questions there. Research locations in growth. Yeah, look, there's lots of different things. Basically, the way I do it is I will look at areas, but what I'll do is I'll monitor them over time, so you can actually see the prices going up. But what you want to be doing is looking at things like state government strategic plans, because what they do is they tell you where the state government is planning to push people, right? So New South Wales government's obviously got a couple of strategic plans that you can look up, and I've got links for those if you want them. Great bedtime reading, I can tell you, 200 pages of strategic planning. But look, they sort of tell you where they're planning for the population to grow. So if they're pushing population out that way and they're putting in the infrastructure and all of that sort of thing into those locations, then people are going to want to go there because things are a lot more accessible. You know, if they're upgrading freeways and things like that, then it makes it easier for them to get to where they need to go. So, you know, from that respect, you can look at things like that, but monitor, you know, areas and watch the prices and see what they're doing. You know, I guess, what else do I look at? Just trying to think off the top of my head. There's lots of other things too, like there's other things you can do. There's subscription-based things that you can access, like DSR scores and location score. These are websites: DSR score, location score. What else can I think of? So there are a number of them that kind of give you indications of where that market is at the moment within, I guess, you know, whether it's above average or below average in growth at the moment and all of that sort of thing. Yeah, I don't know. If I think of some more, I can shoot them through to you. But yeah, anyway, or shoot me some questions and I'll answer them in email. Anyone else? No, I think that's it. I think we've covered everything off. No, that's it. Anyone else? Going, gone? No? Nothing else? All righty. Okay, well, thanks very much for joining us tonight. I hope you all got something out of it, and I was able to teach you something and show you how you can do it. You know, anyone can do it. So yeah, please, you know, just, you know, there's no time like the present, and it doesn't matter where that is. It's always the right time to invest. I'm not just saying that because I'm a buyer's agent. I've never heard anyone that's an investor that says, gee, I'm glad I didn't start that 10 years ago. The earlier you start, the better it will be. And I encourage everyone to, you know, get in and just do something, take action and buy something. You know, even if it doesn't do anything now, time fixes everything in property. Fortunately, it just takes time. But if you don't have to wait that time and you're buying in the right locations, it can happen a lot sooner. So thanks again, everybody, for joining me. I hope you enjoyed it, and hopefully I'll catch you again next time. Thanks a lot.